All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the state of Israel. It's a nation that seems to have been defined by conflict right from the very beginning, all the way to the challenges it faces today. So we're going to unpack its history, its politics, and really try to understand its complicated position in the Middle East. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at how it was an idea forged in conflict. Then we'll dive into its democracy, which is constantly under pressure. After that, we'll examine its doctrine of survival, followed by the enduring core conflict. And finally, we'll talk about its modern identity as the startup fortress nation. All right, first up, an idea forged in conflict. Let's dig into the historical foundations. How did an idea really born out of centuries of persecution turn into a full-fledged nation-state that was, well, forged in conflict from day one? So, the story of modern Israel really kicks off with Zionism. And you have to understand, this wasn't just some abstract religious idea. No, it was a political movement born in the late 19th century in Europe. It was fueled by two huge things: this new wave of nationalism sweeping the continent, and, tragically, some absolutely brutal waves of anti-Jewish persecution. At its heart, the goal was simple: self-determination, a safe place, a haven for Jewish people in their historical homeland. Okay, this timeline really lays out how we got from an idea to an actual state. It all starts to get real with Britain's Balfour Declaration in 1917, which, it suddenly gave the whole concept international backing. Then, fast forward to 1947, the UN comes up with its partition plan, and that leads directly to 1948, when Israel declares its independence. But here's the thing. Statehood immediately meant war, and those wars in 67 and 73, they were absolutely game-changing. They didn't just reshape the map, they completely reshaped Israel's entire mindset about security. Now, this is really interesting because it's so easy to just assume that this conflict was inevitable from the very beginning, right? But check out this quote from Amir Faisal, who was a major Arab leader at the time. He's saying that the two movements could complete one another. It suggests that, at least for a moment, some people saw common ground. They didn't see Jewish and Arab nationalism as automatic enemies. It really throws a wrench in that simple story of just nonstop hostility. Okay, so moving on to our second point, democracy under pressure. We're going to turn it inward now, because Israel built this really vibrant democracy, but it is a system that is constantly under pressure, often from divisions right inside Israeli society. So the heart of Israeli politics is the Knesset, which is their parliament. But here's the key. It's not like a two-party system. It's more like a multi-party free-for-all. What that means is that basically no single party ever gets enough votes to govern alone. So to run the country, they have to form these coalitions. And these coalitions, well, they can be super fragile and bring together parties that disagree on almost everything. As you can imagine, trying to make big long-term decisions in that kind of environment is, incredibly tough. And this right here, this is the core power struggle in Israel's government. It's a showdown between the Knesset, the elected parliament that represents the will of the people, and the Supreme Court, which is supposed to be the check on that power. It's this fundamental tension that just recently blew up into a massive national crisis. So, in 2023, the government tried to push through this huge judicial overhaul, and people went nuts. Critics said the changes were a direct attack on democracy itself. We're talking about things like getting rid of the reasonableness standard, which was basically a tool the court could use to say, hey, this government decision is just completely irrational, you can't do it. They also wanted to give politicians way more control over who gets to be a judge. The fear was that this would gut the power of the courts and remove a key check on the government. And this question, right here, this is at the absolute heart of Israel's internal debate. How do you balance your democratic ideals with what you see as constant existential threats? It's that very tension that perfectly leads us to our next topic: how Israel sees the world and its own place in it. Okay, Section 3, a doctrine of survival. You gotta remember, Israel was basically born into a hostile neighborhood. So from day one, its foreign policy and military strategy have been built on one single fundamental idea: just survive. So Israel's security playbook really comes down to these four things. 1. Deterrence. Be so strong that nobody dares to attack you. 2. Early warning. Use your intelligence to see threats coming from a mile away. 3. Decisive victory. If a war does happen, don't let it drag on. Win it, and win it fast. And 4. Transferring the war. If there's a fight, make sure it's happening on their turf, not yours. The key takeaway here is that the goal is defensive, to survive, but the methods are often incredibly offensive.
So, you want to know the most powerful symbol of the US-Israel alliance? It might just be this number, 42. What is that? Well, that's the number of times the United States has used its veto power at the UN Security Council to block resolutions that were critical of Israel. 42 times, more than for any other nation on Earth. That veto, that's really the bedrock of what they call the special relationship.
Israel's foreign policy is this constant high-wire balancing act. On one side, you have the United States, which is the absolute cornerstone ally. We're talking billions in military aid every year. Then there's Russia. That relationship used to be a kind of pragmatic friendship, but it's really frayed lately, especially with Moscow getting cozier with Israel's enemies like Iran. And then you've got the European Union. You could say the relationship status is it's complicated. The EU is a massive trading partner, but it's also one of Israel's loudest critics, especially when it comes to settlements. And then, in 2020, came a massive shift in the region, the Abraham Accords. This was a huge deal. For decades, the rule was land for peace. The Arab world wouldn't make peace with Israel until the Palestinian issue was solved. The Abraham Accords completely flipped that script. Suddenly, countries like the UAE and Bahrain were normalizing relations with Israel without a Palestinian state. What changed? Well, it created a new kind of alliance, one built on shared business interests and, maybe even more importantly, a shared enemy in Iran. But even with all these new alliances, the oldest, most difficult conflict, the one with the Palestinians, is still right there at the very heart of the region's problems. That brings us to Section 4, the enduring core conflict. So, why has peace been so elusive for all these decades? Well, it's because you're dealing with this tangled knot of what feel like impossible issues. You've got the Israeli settlements in the West Bank. You have the status of Jerusalem, a city holy to so many and claimed by both sides. You have the question of what to do about Palestinian refugees. And of course, the deep, deep security fears on both sides. Then you throw groups like Hamas and Hezbollah into that mix, and the path to peace, well, it starts to look like a maze with no exit. And that brings us to the huge, unanswered question that hangs over everything. For decades, the official goal of pretty much all international diplomacy was the two-state solution. It was the only game in town. But you look at the situation on the ground today, and a lot of people are asking, is that even possible anymore? Is it still a realistic option? All right, our final section, we're going to look at the other side of Israel's identity. It's not just a military power, it's also a technological and economic one. This is the startup fortress nation. You've probably heard the nickname the Startup Nation. And it's true. Israel is an absolute global powerhouse in technology. We're talking everything from cybersecurity to groundbreaking water tech. Their Silicon Wadi attracts tons of investment from all over the world. But here's the fascinating part. This innovation is directly connected to its military reality. In fact, it's often fueled by it. So many of these successful tech companies were started by people coming out of elite military tech and intelligence units. They're literally turning their defense skills into economic power. And that duality, right there, is really the paradox at the heart of modern Israel. On one hand, you have the startup nation, this vibrant, creative place on the cutting edge of innovation. But on the other hand, you have the fortress nation, a country that lives in a constant state of high alert, forever shaped by conflict and the feeling that it's always under threat. Which really leaves us with this one final central question. Can a nation be both of those things at once? A vibrant democracy and a permanent fortress? Can those two identities really coexist forever? That balancing act between the demands of the fortress and the ideals of a democracy, that is the fundamental challenge for Israel. And how it answers that question will, without a doubt, define its future.